in the process. And then the luck ran out. 3 14-inch shells from the Japanese battleship Congo struck the Johnston in quick succession. They hit her engine room. They hit her steering. They hit her communications. The damage was catastrophic and instantaneous. The Johnston lost power to 3 of her 5-inch guns. She lost an engine. Her gyro compass went out. And then, almost immediately after, 3 6-inch shells hit her bridge. Commander Ernest Evans was seriously wounded. 2 fingers on his left hand were blown off. His shirt was blown off his body. He was bleeding, stunned, in tremendous pain, and he waved away the ship's doctor who came to help him, telling the doctor to go tend to others who needed it more. The Johnston ducked into a rain squall, and her crew worked desperately to make whatever repairs they could. They got one engine back to limited function. They made the rudder operable by hand steering. They shored up what they could. And Evans, bleeding, missing fingers, with no shirt, moved his command post from the destroyed bridge to a secondary position further aft on the ship, where he could shout orders through a hatch to the men manning the rudder below. He was not done. The Johnston was not done. When the squall passed and the Johnston emerged back into the fight, what she found was chaos. The other destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 Screen, the Hole, the Heerman, the Samuel B. Roberts, the Raymond, the Dennis, the John C. Butler had been engaging the Japanese force in a furious series of torpedo attacks and gun runs. They were all taking punishment. The Hole was already badly damaged and sinking. The Samuel B. Roberts was fighting with the ferocity of a ship twice her size. The escort carriers were taking hits. The situation was desperate. And the Johnston, battered, short one engine, steered by hand, her captain wounded, threw herself back into the fight. For the next hour and a half, the Johnston continued to engage the Japanese fleet. She fired her guns at whatever target presented itself. She used her remaining mobility to place herself between the Japanese and the escort carriers again and again, drawing fire onto herself to protect the more vulnerable ships. She charged Japanese destroyers when they tried to close on the carriers for torpedo attacks, forcing them to deal with her instead. It was during this extended phase of the battle that the Yamato's enormous guns found their range. An 18.1-inch shell from the Yamato struck the Johnston. Let us pause here for just a moment, because there is something almost surreal about this fact that deserves full appreciation. The largest naval gun ever mounted on a warship, firing a shell that weighed 3,200 pounds, the kind of weapon designed to destroy other battleships, the kind of shell that could go through several feet of battle steel, struck a destroyer. The Johnston was built for speed, not for absorbing punishment from capital ship guns. An 18.1-inch shell hitting the Johnston was, in engineering terms, grotesque overkill. It was like using a sledgehammer to crack a matchstick. And yet the Johnston was still there, still fighting. The 18.1-inch shell hit the Johnston at a point approximately 2/3 of the way down her hull, and it caused the kind of structural damage that would eventually split the ship apart. But even that did not stop her immediately. She was broken. She was on fire. She was running on one engine that was barely functioning. But she was still in the fight. The Japanese destroyers eventually swarmed the Johnston, surrounding her and bombarding her at close range, ensuring her destruction. One shell after another found their mark. The Johnston's last engine was knocked out, leaving her dead in the water. One by one, her guns were silenced either by direct hits or by loss of power. The bridge was completely destroyed, uninhabitable. The ship was burning in multiple places. She was splitting apart at the point where the Yamato's giant shell had struck her. Evans moved from position to position on his dying ship, continuing to direct the defense with whatever was still working. Witnesses reported seeing him shouting orders through the hatch, calling out target bearings, refusing to stop. He was in tremendous pain from his wounds, missing fingers, covered in blood, and he kept going. He kept going because his crew was still there, and they were following his lead, and as long as there was even a fraction of a fighting chance, Ernest Evans was going to take it. At 9:45 in the morning, with the Johnston sinking beneath him and nothing more that could be done, Commander Ernest Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The men went over the side. Evans himself was observed abandoning ship, seen in a lifeboat, returning the salute of the crew of the Japanese destroyer Yukikase, which had drawn up to the sinking Johnston not to fire another shot but to render honors to a worthy opponent. That image, that moment, a Japanese ship pausing in the midst of battle to salute a dying American destroyer. It tells you everything you need to know about how the men who faced the Johnston regarded what they had witnessed that morning. At 10:10 in the morning, the USS Johnston rolled over and slipped beneath the Philippine Sea. Of her complement of 327 men, 186 died. Some in the battle itself. Some in the water afterward, where survivors drifted for 50 hours before being rescued. At least 90 men vanished into the sea along with their captain. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans was never seen again. He was 36 years old. The 141 survivors who were eventually rescued told the story. And through their testimony, and through the accounts of Japanese officers who were there, the full scope of what the Johnston had done became clear. Now let us step back and look at the bigger picture of the battle off Samar, because the Johnston did not fight alone, and understanding the full context makes what happened that morning even more remarkable. Taffy 3 as a whole unit performed one of the most astonishing defensive actions in the history of naval warfare. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, realizing that his little force was facing annihilation, did not panic. He ordered his carriers to run. He ordered them to zigzag. He launched every aircraft he had, even planes that were not armed with anti-ship weapons, sending them in to attack the Japanese fleet or simply to confuse and disrupt the Japanese gunners. He called desperately for help from other forces, and the men of his screen gave him every second they could buy. The USS Hull made her torpedo runs and continued fighting even after she had lost most of her propulsion and armament. She sank at 8:55 in the morning, with 253 of her 326 men lost. The USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort far smaller and more lightly armed than even the Johnston, fought with such ferocity that she became known as the little destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. She fired her torpedoes and then continued fighting with her guns until she had expended virtually all her ammunition, and then she was sunk by Japanese gunfire at 9:35 in the morning, with 89 of her 224 men lost. The USS Heermann, the only destroyer to survive the battle intact, made multiple torpedo runs and continued fighting throughout the engagement. The carrier aircraft attacking with bombs, torpedoes, and when those ran out, with strafing runs and even dummy attacks where pilots flew at the Japanese ships with empty guns simply to break up their formations and force them to maneuver, played a crucial role. Pilots from Taffy 2 and Taffy 1 also joined the fight, their aircraft adding to the pressure on the Japanese fleet. And then, at 9:20 in the morning, something happened that nobody on either side quite expected. Vice Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force from the Yamato's bridge, ordered a withdrawal. He turned his fleet around and headed north, away from the American carriers, away from the Leyte landing beaches, away from the targets he had come to destroy. He had the most powerful surface force in the world at that moment, and he turned it around. Why? That question has been debated by historians ever since. Kurita himself gave various explanations over the years. He had been under air attack for hours. He had lost 3 ships, 2 heavy cruisers and a light cruiser during the battle. He had no air cover of his own. His communications were chaotic. He had been misled by signals intelligence into thinking that a major American fleet force was nearby. He was exhausted, having been in the water himself after his flagship had been sunk the previous day. He may have overestimated the strength of the force opposing him. And perhaps most fundamentally, the ferocity of the American defense had convinced him that the force he was facing was far more powerful than the lightly armed screen of tin cans it actually was. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 had fought so hard, so aggressively, so beyond all expectation, that the Japanese had genuinely been confused about what they were facing. The Johnston, the Hull, the Heermann, the Samuel B. Roberts, these ships had acted with such offensive intent, such disregard for the disparity in firepower, that the Japanese commanders had difficulty believing they were fighting destroyers and destroyer escorts rather than heavy cruisers and fleet destroyers. Whatever the reasons, Kurita turned back. The escort carriers survived. The Leyte landing beaches were not attacked. The invasion force ashore was protected. The strategic objective was achieved, at an enormous cost in blood and steel paid by the men of Taffy 3. The Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole was the largest naval battle in history, and it ended in a decisive Allied victory. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy was essentially finished as a fighting force. Never again would it contest American control of the Pacific in any meaningful way. The battle marked the end of Japan as a naval power, and the outcome at Samar, the survival of Taffy 3 against all probability, was a critical piece of that result. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration that the United States can bestow. He became the first Native American in the history of the United States Navy to receive that honor, one of only 2 destroyer captains in all of World War II to be awarded the Medal of Honor. The USS Johnston received 6 battle stars for her service, and the ship and her crew received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. The wreck of the Johnston lay undisturbed at the bottom of the Philippine Sea for decades. The waters she fought in are above the Philippine Trench, one of the deepest submarine trenches in the world. In 2019, search efforts located her general position, but the equipment available at the time could not quite reach her depth. It was not until March 2021 that former U.S. Navy commander and explorer Victor Vescovo, piloting a deep-sea submersible called the Limiting Factor, with a hull 3.5 inches thick specifically designed to withstand crushing depths, finally found the USS Johnston at a depth of 21,180 feet, approximately 4 miles beneath the surface. That made her the deepest shipwreck ever found. Even in her final resting place, the Johnston had gone deeper than anyone else. The photographs and footage from that expedition are haunting and extraordinary. The Johnston lies broken, as you might expect from a ship that took the kind of punishment she took. But you can still see her guns. You can still see her torpedo tubes. You can still see the structures and the fittings that the men of her crew lived and worked and died among. She is at rest now, and the deep cold of the Philippine Trench preserves her in the dark. In November 2023, U.S. Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro announced that a new guided missile destroyer, DDG-141, to be built as part of the Arleigh Burke class, would be named the USS Ernest E. Evans. The announcement was made during Native American Heritage Month, a fitting tribute. The new ship will carry the name and the spirit of the man who proved that courage has no relation to the size of the vessel you command or the odds stacked against you. But let us return, before we close, to the man himself. Because it is easy, in telling a story like this, to focus so much on the tactics and the ships and the statistics that we lose sight of the human being at the center of it all. Ernest Evans was a man, a real man, a man who grew up in difficult circumstances and refused to let those circumstances define his ceiling. A man who earned everything he had through talent and work and force of will, without connections, without advantage, without the kind of background that opened doors easily in 1920s America. A man who carried within him the deep, quiet pride of his Cherokee and Creek heritage, even as he navigated a society that did not always honor that heritage. A man who learned the meaning of humiliation when he had to run in the Battle of the Java Sea, and who resolved with every fiber of his being that it would never happen again. When Evans stood before his crew at the commissioning of the Johnston in October 1943 and said, "I will never again retreat from an enemy force," he was not making a tactical statement. He was making a statement about who he was. And on October 25, 1944, in the waters east of Samar, against a force that included the largest battleship ever built, with shells from 9-inch guns splashing around him and then shells from 18-inch guns tearing through his ship, with 2 fingers gone and no shirt and blood running down his arm, with 1 engine left and a rudder steered by hand, he kept that promise. He kept that promise. The Japanese destroyer Yukikase, drawing up beside the sinking Johnston to render honors, was not an act of sentiment. It was an acknowledgement from professional sailors, from fighting men who understood what they had seen, that something extraordinary had occurred. The men of the Yukikase had faced the Johnston. They had seen what she did. They had seen 1 ship, 1 destroyer charge a fleet. And they saluted her because what else do you do in the face of something like that? Some survivors say Evans made it to a life raft. Some say he went down with his ship. The Japanese commander Tarachi of the Yukikase later claimed he saw Evans in a lifeboat, returning the salute that his crew offered as they passed. What we know for certain is that he was badly wounded, that he gave the order to abandon ship, that he was seen alive in the water after the Johnston went under. And then he was gone. Gone into the same deep waters that would eventually hold his ship, for miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. He was 36 years old. He had been the captain of the Johnston for just over a year. In that year, he had taken his ship into combat repeatedly, had performed with distinction at every turn, and had finally led her into an action that will be studied and remembered as long as men build ships and sail them to war. There is a quote from Lieutenant Robert Hagan, the Johnston's gunnery officer, that I keep coming back to. He called Evans a captain who could strike fighting spirit from his men the way steel strikes spark from a flint. Think about that image. The way steel strikes spark from flint. It does not happen gently. It does not happen slowly. It is an instantaneous, fierce, bright thing. And it catches fire. And it burns. That was Ernest Evans. That was the fire he lit in the men of the Johnston. And on October 25, 1944, that fire burned bright enough to push back a fleet. The story of the USS Johnston and Commander Ernest Evans is not just a story about a battle. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when they decide, with full understanding of the cost, that there are things worth more than their own survival. Evans knew, when he ordered that turn toward the enemy fleet, that he was probably writing his own death. He knew it when he fired the torpedoes. He knew it when the first shells hit and blew off his fingers and destroyed his bridge. And he kept going. Why? Not because regulations required it. Not because someone ordered him to. Because there were men on those carriers who would die if he did not. Because there were soldiers on those beaches who needed those carriers. Because someone had to do something and the Johnston was there and he was its captain and he had made a promise. That is what heroism actually looks like when you strip away the myth and the legend. It is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more than the fear. It is the willingness to make the hardest possible choice with full knowledge of what it will cost. It is Ernest Evans ordering full speed toward the Yamato. The battle off Samar is sometimes called the last stand of the Tin Can Sailors, after a 2004 book of that title. It is an apt phrase. These were the tin cans, the small ships, the unarmored and lightly armed and unsung ships of the American fleet. They were not the battleships. They were not the heavy cruisers. They were the ones that were supposed to be in the background, supporting the big boys, staying out of range of the really heavy weapons. On October 25, 1944, they stepped out of the background and changed the course of history. The wreck of the Johnston sits at 21,180 feet, in the dark and the cold, for miles below the surface of the sea where she fought. Her guns are still there. Her torpedo tubes are still there. And somewhere near her, perhaps, are the remains of the men who could not be saved. The men who gave everything they had on a morning when the odds were impossible and the mission was simply to buy enough time for others to survive. They did that. They bought the time. They paid the price. Remember their names. The USS Johnston. The USS Hull, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the USS Heermann, the men of Taffy 3, and above all, remember the half-Cherokee boy from Pawnee, Oklahoma, who was told in 1,000 quiet ways throughout his life that he was less than, that doors were not open to him, that his heritage and his background limited what he could become. He heard all of that, and he became Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, captain of a fighting ship, Medal of Honor recipient, the man who charged the Yamato with a destroyer and refused to retreat even when the world was on fire around him. When the new USS Ernest E. Evans, DDG-141, is finally commissioned and sails the seas, she will carry a name that means something. A name that stands for the idea that courage is not about the size of your ship or the power of your guns. It is about the content of your character and the strength of your commitment to the people who are depending on you. The Johnston refused to sink until there was nothing left to fight with. And even then, even at the moment she finally rolled over and slipped beneath the waves, a Japanese ship paused to salute her. In the long record of naval history, across all the battles and all the ships and all the men who have ever sailed to war, it is hard to think of a moment more profoundly moving than that. A ship beyond saving, a captain missing, a crew in the water, and an enemy who looked at what had just happened and understood, with the deep recognition that only fighting men can share, that they had witnessed something that transcended the war itself. Something that transcended nations and flags and the ideologies that had put them all there in that water on that morning. They had witnessed what a human being can do when they decide, with complete clarity and without reservation, that they will not quit. That is the story of the USS Johnston. That is the story of Commander Ernest Evans. And that is why 80 years later we are still telling it.